It's the year 1968, the most expensive year of the conflict in Vietnam, paid for with money and the lives of young Americans. The so-called unwinnable war, which had been going on for multiple years at the time, had already become the center of the public eye because of the form of guerrilla warfare that the American people had never seen nor fought before. However, as many would agree, the biggest point of conflict between Americans during the war was the continuation of a selective service draft. For the average draftee, the draft was not just a call to serve. It was a call to fight for survival, with a system that forced them into a conflict that they neither understood nor wanted. By the mid-1960s, the US government found itself entrenched in a war it could not easily win. The Selective Service Act of 1948, which had been designed to replenish the US military during emergencies, was now being called upon to fill the ranks. The United States, under Presidents Johnson and Nixon, was committed to halting the spread of communism, and the draft was seen as a necessary step to secure victory. National Security Advisor and later Secretary of State under Nixon, Henry Kissinger, also played a crucial role in shaping U.S. foreign policy during the war. For many, the Selective Service Draft would become a symbol of government overreach and a force that altered the fabric of American society as a whole. By 1968, the Vietnam War had become one of the deadliest conflicts in U.S. history. The year marked a turning point in the war as both American and Vietnamese forces suffered staggering losses. The toll was not only measured in human lives, but in the resources spent, the machinery destroyed, and the toll on the morale of both the soldiers and the American public. In terms of casualties, the U.S. faced over 30,000 soldiers killed by the end of 1968, with tens of thousands more wounded. The draft had already taken hundreds of thousands of young men from American homes, many of whom returned to face lifelong physical and psychological scars. While the Vietnamese losses were far greater, with estimates ranging from 500,000 to 1 million soldiers and civilians killed, the American public was forced to confront the magnitude of its involvement. On the battlefield, the cost wasn't only in lives. The US military deployed vast amounts of equipment to Vietnam, yet much of it was destroyed in the fight. Tanks, helicopters, and armored vehicles, symbols of American military strength, were regularly lost to guerrilla tactics and ambushes, along with the unforgiving terrain. In 1968 alone, the U.S. lost over 4,000 helicopters, a devastating blow to the air mobility that was central to its strategy. These losses, both human and material, painted a grim picture for the United States as it entered the year of the Tet Offensive, when the true cost of the war became starkly apparent. Under the Selective Service Act, young men between the ages of 18 and 25 were eligible for the draft. The system used a lottery to determine the order in which men would be called, a process that many found arbitrary and unfair. For many young men, being drafted was a harsh reality. Those who were fortunate enough to avoid the lottery were often criticized, while those called into service faced the possibility of death or disfigurement on the battlefield. And that was the line drawn. Americans had the right to refuse the draft, but in doing so, they were forced to confront a deeper question. Could they justify rejecting the responsibility to serve their country, especially when it meant defying legal and societal expectations? By the late 1960s, resistance to the draft and the war itself had grown, and many Americans began questioning the balance between their rights and responsibilities. The U.S. government argued that serving in the military was a civic responsibility, part of one's duty as a citizen, especially in the context of the Cold War and the fight against communism. But for many, the draft was no longer about national defense. It was about their responsibility to oppose an unjust war.
Against the United States government.
Once more, America was divided. In a nation founded on the principle of individual rights, many young men found it impossible to reconcile their legal obligation to serve with their personal beliefs about the war. They believed they had the right to reject government orders when those orders conflicted with their moral convictions. Activists, students, and even military veterans began organizing against the draft, claiming that they had a responsibility to protest an unjust system that sent people to fight in a war they did not believe in. One of the most powerful acts of defiance came from the draft card burners, those who publicly burned their draft cards as a symbol of rejection and resistance. These actions were seen as an assertion of their individual rights, an act of rebellion against a system that they believed was complicit in perpetuating an unjust war. Draft card burning became a visible, dramatic expression of protest, drawing not just many a crowd, but national attention as well. The government, however, saw the resistance as a threat to social order, and many who refused to comply with the draft were arrested, imprisoned, or vilified as draft dodgers. In doing so, the protesters risked their personal freedom in the name of a higher moral responsibility, to protect the rights of themselves and others from the ravages of war. However, the conflict would soon come to a close, as key figures like Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon pushed for a diplomatic resolution.
Good evening. I have asked for this radio and television time tonight for the purpose of announcing that we today have concluded an agreement to end the war and bring peace with honor in Vietnam and in Southeast Asia.
Their efforts, alongside growing anti-war sentiment and protests at home, led to the 1973 Paris Peace Accords, marking the beginning of U.S. withdrawal and the eventual end of the direct American involvement in the war. And only 4 days after this, on January 27, 1973, the Selective Service Draft was put into a deep standby mode where it remains today. In the years that followed, the all-volunteer force became a cornerstone of U.S. military policy, and the debate over individual rights and civic duty would continue to shape national discourse, reminding Americans of the delicate balance between personal freedoms and national responsibility. The discontinuation of the draft marked a new understanding of what it meant to serve one's country, not as a compulsion, but as a choice.